Last time we discussed the political tensions back in Japan. Now we go back to Korea where Yi Sun-sin's navy is on the move in this week's episode of Japan at War. With the Japanese army already halfway up the Korean peninsula, it became crucial that supply line be made at sea. Without it, essential items such as food, men, medicine, and gunpowder would have to be carried all the way from Busan, which would still be feasible, but would also severely slow the Japanese advance. Small groups from Hideyoshi's fleet at Busan started to probe the west along Korea's southern coast. Navigating around the smaller islands and reefs, and also looking for the best possible route through the Yellow Sea and the way north. Meanwhile, while the Japanese had been on the move towards Seoul, Yi Sun-sin had been preparing his men and ships for the upcoming battles. He also had been gathering maps of the coast to better understand what he was dealing with, and also still making plans to merge his forces with the commander of Chola Right Navy, Yeojin, who had 90 ships under his command. Part of him preparing his men also meant punishing those who spoke out against action, and especially those who tried to desert. For example, when several had tried to leave in the middle of the night during June, Yi had them captured, executed, and then their heads displayed. His reasoning was that this would calm the agitation and the confused minds within camp. And hey, it's pretty hard to argue with that logic. Another man tried to desert again, and he had his head cut off and then hung from a pole in the middle of camp. His hopes to combine his navy with Yeojin's was stopped when an order from the Chosun court ordered him to instead form up with Wong Kyun's Gyeongsang Right Navy. You know, this guy? The guy with only 4 ships left? You know, because he sank them? But he had orders, so he set sail out of Yusu Harbor at 2 in the morning on June 13th. He had around 39 warships in total, 24 large Pinokusan, and 15 smaller ships called Hyopsun. He also had 46 small boats, but they would act as couriers and scouts, not warships. They continued on the water until the next day and set anchor at Sobipo during the night. He arrived the next day at Tangpo for the planned meeting with Wong Kyun. Won had with him only one of his ships, and the news of the Japanese ships near Kadok-do, 50 kilometers northeast on the other side of Koje Island. It took a whole other day for Wong Kyun's ships to arrive. On June 16th, as the Korean fleet made their way around Koje Island, a scout ship rowed its way towards Yi's ship and told him that the Japanese was anchored at Okpo port and not at Kadok. His fleet set itself in a battle position around the mouth of Okpo. Around noon the next day, the smaller vessels at the left and right, with the larger craft, including Yi's, in the center, forming a line. Wong Kyun is said to have been at the rear. Yi Sun-sin then sent a message to all of his ships via courier boats to stand firm like a mountain. they then advanced. As they made their way through, they counted at least 50 plus ships with their anchors down in front of Okpo village. The ships had barely any crew aboard, and most of the men were actually in the village itself, setting some of the buildings on fire and looting, which, if you remember, was actually against the law that Hideyoshi put out in February. Remember, it was his ultimate goal to win over the Koreans and then eventually adopt them into his armies for the push into China. But he wasn't there to enforce this. So, unfortunately, this happened quite regularly. There was so much smoke that the Japanese just did not see the Korean fleet until the ships were practically on top of them. An alarm was raised, and the men there started to panic. Some ran back to their ships, and others ran to the hills in the opposite direction. The men that did reach their ships didn't actually set out to engage Yi's fleet. Instead, they hugged the shoreline in the hopes to escape. The Korean forces soon closed in on the Japanese ships. The men aboard tried to fight back with some of their matchlocks, but they had little effect on the thick siding of the Korean ships. While they did this, the Koreans blasted holes in them with cannonballs and iron tip arrows. Next, the Koreans fired arrows on top of the decks of the Japanese. In response, the men started to throw anything that they could, anything that wasn't bolted down, overboard to lighten the load, and rowed as hard as they could. But even that didn't work. Some of the men actually gave up entirely and jumped overboard, with the hopes to swim to shore. The abandoned vessels were then set on fire. After the battle, 26 vessels of the Japanese had either been sunk or were burning. The waters were a mess of debris and corpses. It's said that only 3 men managed to be injured on the Korean side, and none of them had died, and even their ships were in perfect fighting condition. The men aboard the ships yelled in triumph, and soon the men started to call upon Yi Sun-sin to give the command to have the men pursue the Japanese that had fled. And Yi Sun-sin seriously considered doing this. He had seen how the Japanese had treated the villagers and would have loved to have had them hunted down. But he decided against it. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, why didn't he? Well, he had carefully weighed it against what he knew of the enemy. Sending men after the enemy might produce a few dead enemies, at best. At worst, his own men might have actually gotten cut down by the matchlocks of the Japanese. At worst, the Japanese could try and then attack his ships while they were ashore. And then, who really knows what could have happened? They could even be attacked by other Japanese ships that could be in the area. He decided that their strength lay at sea and the enemy's on land. He and his men had just started to prepare for a meal in victory when a scout reported that 5 large enemy ships were sailing nearby. Yi set out after them immediately. The Japanese made a quick escape to the mainland at the port of Hapo. This time now, that his concerns had been validated, he didn't even think of landing men. He simply had the 5 ships burned, The fleet then rested at the tip of Kojai Island, and they didn't rest long. After sun was up on June 17th, a group of refugees told them that 13 enemy ships were anchored to the west. Yi set sail again and found them at Chojimpo. The battle went the exact same way as it had at Okpo, except this time the Japanese didn't even bother fighting, and instead retreated into the hills. And once again, Yi burned their ships. Later that same day, Yi and Naval Commander Wong Kyun made plans to attack Chonsongpo and Kadok Island, where more of the enemy was spotted. They even thought of going straight to Busan to burn all the enemy ships there as well. Then, just as they were about to finalize their plans, a messenger burst into the room and told them of the news of the capital and that their king had been forced north. The two men are said to have burst into tears and fell into each other's arms. With this news, the two parted ways and went to their home ports. On June 18th, Yi sent a long dispatch to the Korean court of their victories at sea, a severed Japanese ear, and a captured matchlock to be sent north. In his letter, he pointed out that during the Battle of Okpo, 2 of his men had been injured by friendly fire. As Yi's men had started to capture a Japanese vessel during the battle, Wong Kyun's ship actually opened fire on them. And it seems like this was just simply a mistake, and that Wong Kyun had not seen that these were Yi's men. Still though, this pissed Yi Sun-sin off. And he wrote this: "Nothing is more shameful than a commander's lack of discipline over his men. And I hope his actions will be corrected by the court." Now, this was the first real success of the Koreans, and it really showed where Korea's real strength was. And trust me, Yi Sun-sin is not done yet. See you next time on the next episode of Japan at War.